sections. Bring this up a little bit more.
Kyle woke up. He is famous. Kyle thought very carefully. Kyle was struck with an uncomfortable thought. Lying here, he wondered, what am I accomplishing? Am I furthering my goals? Am I making a difference in the world? Am I helping anyone? Kyle was suddenly gripped with a cold fear. Was Kyle living his life well? Would anyone care when he was gone? Was Kyle worthwhile? He shot up from his lying position, breathing heavily.
Oh?
Kyle looked around his room, wondering where all the fear had come from. But something had gripped him, something meaningful, something important. Kyle realized that it was time to fulfill his duty to society. He would serve the city through deduction. He would serve by providing answers. Kyle decided that he, now, would be a detective. With a newfound confidence, Kyle stepped out of bed, knowing he must direct himself to the city hall to get started immediately. Today, Kyle would try his best at being a detective. Kyle... Kyle knelt down to inspect a hatch on the floor. It seemed to be locked with a small keyhole. Kyle inserted the key into the hatch and turned... With a click, the hatch... Kyle slid into the tunnel. He found that it was vacuum-powered and sucked him quickly into the darkness. Suddenly, Kyle burst through the wall of his apartment hallway. He fell on the floor. Kyle had found a new way to get to City Hall. Kyle entered the mayoral office. Mayor Tom, the elected mayor, was sitting behind his desk. In that moment, Kyle realized declaring himself detective doesn't magically give him permission to enter government offices. Compounding the problem, Kyle now realized that in his excitement, he had not put on any clothes. Mayor Tom looked at Kyle with large, sad eyes. This was not a problem he had wanted to deal with today. Mayor Tom sadly removed a large stick from under his desk and began to beat Kyle senseless.
Oh.
Ouch, said Tom. Ouch, ouch! Kyle decided he would need to leave. Over the rest of the day, Kyle tried to re-enter the mayoral office several times. Eventually, Mayor Tom moved his desk to cover the door to his office, preventing either enter or exit. Mayor Tom found he was unable to access the necessities of life, like food and water. Mayor Tom withered away, leaving the city in a state of unmanaged chaos. Cars began spinning on their axles. Without will, men and women started contorting into balls and swirls. The very air vibrated. The only force that had kept the laws of physics in Kyle's city from devolving into entropy was the solid ruling of Mayor Tom. Kyle realized it had probably been a good thing that he had not gotten the chance to be part of the city rule. It was a large responsibility, wasn't it? Keeping everything organized, making good choices. Kyle wistfully thought back to Mayor Tom. He smiled. Kyle had a new respect for Mayor Tom. He was an excellent man. He had done well for the city. Kyle's features began to fold into themselves, pressing and stretching into hundreds of newfound directions. Kyle had indeed made a difference in the world.
The end.
Kyle was struck with a... Today, Kyle would try his...
Okay, let's get crust.
Kyle decided to take some... Kyle donned a dusty detective suit, complete with a pipe and an old ascot cap. Mayor Tom... In that moment, Kyle found himself in an uncomfortable... Kyle was very nervous. Kyle didn't exactly know what to say. He began to quiver and sweat. Kyle's metabolism went into overdrive, breaking down all of the fat in his body as energy for sweat production. Kyle began to shoot liquid from his pores with uncomfortable velocity. In a sudden collapse, Kyle's body imploded, creating a massive wave that filled Mayor Tom's office. Desperate for moisture to continue sweat production, Kyle's pores began to suck every drop of water from the air. The city began to flood with salt water as all liquid was repurposed by Kyle. Within hours, Kyle had created mankind's first artificial saltwater ocean. Families from around the country came to visit and bask in the sunlight. A beach was created, surf shops opened. Kyle was greeted on the street and asked for photos. Parents told him that his ocean was a popular spot to spend their weekends with their children. In his own way, Kyle had made a difference in his city.
Good for him.
Kyle was struck. Today, Kyle would try his best at being a detective. Kyle decided. Kyle. Mayor. In that. Kyle found himself in an uncomfortable situation. Kyle was sure Mayor Tom would. Excuse me. Mayor Tom.
Son,
He said,
this idea of yours cannot be true. There are but two ways to take the role of detective for this city.
said Mayor Tom.
Or second, by defeating me in hand-to-hand combat.
Oh,
Mayor Tom jumped on Kyle and started punching his face with both hands. Kyle was taken aback by Mayor Tom's power and agility.
that would be
However, Kyle knew this was about more than just a fistfight. This was about being able to make a difference. Kyle began to attack Mayor Tom viciously, grabbing at his hair and slapping him across the face. The two fought zealously. Bruises were formed, furniture was overturned, but Kyle could not withstand Mayor Tom's power. Mayor Tom drew his arm back and let loose a deadly haymaker, sending Kyle crashing through the office door. Kyle lay on the ground, unable to continue fighting. Mayor Tom stepped over top him, looking downward sadly.
I hoped, perhaps,
Said Mayor Tom.
that you would be the one.
Mayor Tom returned to his office. Eventually, Kyle was able to return to his feet. Sheepishly, he left City Hall and returned to his apartment. Kyle sat on his bed and thought about Mayor Tom. He had moved so quickly. He fought with honor, fury, and dedication. Kyle realized he was not ready to be a detective. He had to spend his time training. He would train hard. He would train harder. Kyle slowly fell asleep, thinking about the ways he would gain strength and eventually take on Mayor Tom again. Kyle slept deeply.
Let's try out.
Kyle thought very carefully. Kyle was struck today. Kyle decided. Kyle found himself in an uncomfortable. Mayor Tom, said Kyle, I am so sorry. Mayor Tom looked at Kyle sadly. He saw Kyle as a poor, incompetent man who had not had a strong guiding force in his life. Mayor Tom felt sorry for Kyle.
No,
Said Mayor Tom,
I am sorry. You are a poor, misguided soul. You are a man wrought of the misguided nature of our city. I see you as a problem, not your person, but what you represent, the sad demise of capability. However,
continued Mayor Tom,
I feel more sorry for my bear. He is hungry. I would like to feed you to him.
Mayor Tom pulled a lever on his desk. The wall beside him was pulled into the floor, revealing a grungy, untamed bear. In a raging need to devour, the bear rushed outwards and swallowed the first thing it saw, which was Mayor Tom. The bear sat on the floor. It looked at Kyle complacently while silently digesting Mayor Tom. Kyle decided it would be a good time to leave. Kyle walked outside City Hall. He decided to take some time in the park across the street and just think for a bit. Kyle sat on a bench. he watched as the sun slowly set in the sky, laying a creamy orange color over everything. Suddenly, Kyle was happy he had not been eaten by Mayor Tom's bear.
I would be too.
Perhaps, he thought, he could try to be a detective again tomorrow.
Trophy.
Kyle thought very... Kyle was today... A cold breeze, a dark... And then, suddenly...
That was an easy one.
Kyle was struck with an... Today... "Hello, you," said Kyle. Kyle decided what he would ask the secretary. Something really important. This morning, a mystery. Kyle slammed his paw. Okay, she said. The secretary opened her desk. Kyle looked over the list. Question 1. When you are examining a crime scene, what should you wear on your hands? Question 2. After investigating a crime scene, detectives should file a report to... Question 3. If you find a body in the middle of the street, you... Question 4. Jerry the hot dog boy has committed a heinous crime with a lot of evidence. Is he guilty? Question 5. You have been made into a detective. What is the first thing you do? Kyle got up from the floor and gave his test back to the secretary for review. The secretary glanced over Kyle's answers briefly. Well, actually, no. The secretary threw Kyle's paper on her desk. You have answered wrong. I am angry. The secretary She drew her hands from her side and began to cry. The secretary had turned into an electro bear, bent on vengeance against Kyle.
Oh.
The electro bear lunged at Kyle, viciously trying to rip his flesh to bits with its teeth. Kyle spent his evening being attacked by the electro bear. Eventually, Kyle was able to escape City Hall. He made his way back to his apartment. Kyle lay on his bed and thought back to his detective test. He realized that he would probably need to spend some time studying before he tried again. Kyle thought that would probably take a lot of time and decided to give up. Kyle went to bed. Tomorrow, he would not be a detective. Kyle was today. Hello. Kyle decided what he would... Something... This... Okay. Question 1. When you are examining a crime scene, what should you wear on your hands? Question 2. After investigating a crime scene, detectives should file a report to... Question 3. If you find a body in the middle of the street, you... Question 4. Jerry the hot dog boy has committed... Question 5. You have been made into a detective. What is the first thing... Kyle got... She smiled. This looks spot on. The secretary scrawled a red check mark with a plus on top of the paper and... Kyle understood that he had been given a The secretary placed a detective ID into a thick sheet of paper and... This is your... The city needs a hero... Kyle exited City Hall. Kyle realized that crime, villainy, dastardly deed. Kyle would combat them all. Kyle had officially started his job as a detective. Kyle thought very... Kyle was struck with an... Today... He looked at the odd... Kyle felt important. Kyle then realized... Kyle stopped smiling cheek. But after a... If he didn't have a case aside... Kyle started to... Kyle spent his evening looking at bugs and scraps of trash. He did not find... Today, Kyle... A dark shadow... Kyle thought... Kyle was struck with an... Today... Hello? Kyle decided what he would ask the secretary. I've come to resign, said Kyle. Oh, okay, said... First, you need to sign this form saying that you won't... Secondly, you need to sign this form saying that the city has every right to silence you as they see... And, finally, this one that says we can hunt you down and bury you deep if you cause us trouble. All right, she said, smiling. All I need now is your detective ID, and you're free to go. Kyle handed over his... Kyle walked his life as a detective. But tonight, Kyle had...
Gotta get that back.
Kyle thought very carefully. Kyle, today... Kyle decided what he would ask. Question 1. Question 2. After investigating a... Question 3. If you find a... Question 5. Kyle... Kyle thought... Kyle was struck with a... Today... Kyle quickly crouched down on the floor. Kyle lay in the middle... After a... Kyle's... It... Kyle's... He began... From that... Suddenly... Kyle lived his days as a puddle, buying groceries, visiting with friends, and It was a tough life, but a fulfilling one. Kyle made friends, paid bills, and donated to charity. He never forgot, but Kyle remained... Kyle thought very carefully. Kyle was struck. Today, Kyle would try. Kyle decided. Kyle. Kyle entered the Mayor. Kyle rifled through the cases to decide which he would investigate this evening. Kyle exited Mayor. It was time. It was a very rainy night. Just as the sun left, they were looking. Neighbor.
Good evening, Detective,
said Mayor Tom.
I hope you're prepared to start your investigation.
Kyle not.
Well,
Kyle... After a couple minutes of other chit-chat, Kyle decided to start investigating. Kyle grabbed the corpse by the... He began... The corpse did not seem eager to respond to... In a single brisk move, Kyle brought his hand upward. Hey, corpse! I need to talk to you! The corpse Kyle had not noticed, but... Standing on its hind... After... Kyle turned. I'm sorry, everyone. Kyle turned his. Kyle. Puddles were. Kyle. The murderer impersonated.
Cursor.
It was time to investigate the alleged crimes of Jerry the Hot Dog. After a couple minutes of other chit-chat, Kyle decided to start Kyle... The corpse did... This is so impossible! Kyle threw the corpse on the ground and started stamping it. Kyle circled around. Kyle began to run over the corpse, Mayor Tom, Gabby, the photography equipment, and everything else fell. Soon, Kyle had... In anguish, Kyle began... The world being the last 3D object in existence, Kyle was no longer able to... Kyle used his new free time. Kyle had become... The mystery of Jerry the Hot Dog Boy remained too hard to solve. It was time. After a couple minutes of other chit-chat, Kyle decided to start investigating. Kyle knelt on the ground and there was... As Kyle held up a note wet, Kyle began to read... I am a cold-blooded killer, and this man is yet another one of... I wrote this note to make
It seems.
Kyle nodded understandingly. Kyle finished Mayor Tom's thought. Everyone's... Kyle trying to illustrate the lack of Jerry the... Suddenly, there was... The group continued to look for... After a while, they decided that since Kyle had swallowed the... Kyle was temporarily convicted of several hot dog-related murders. Kyle spent an afternoon... But although Kyle was convicted of the crimes, the murderer... It was time. After a couple minutes of other chit-chat, Kyle decided to start Kyle nodded. Kyle finished Mayor Tom's thought. Yeah, that you're Jerry the Hot Dog Boy. Don't worry, said Kyle. Kyle started to pace. Why would it be there? What could it mean? Everyone looked at Kyle, completely flustered. You see, we are all Jerry the...
Kyle, were you... I cannot stand for the...
Kyle realized he had made a mistake. He looked... I'm really sorry, everyone. The mood... As the... Somehow, in... Not all. It was... After a couple minutes of other chit-chat, Kyle decided... Each hot dog... In fact... Kyle... And yet, he was intrigued. Kyle... Wanting to measure the balance of the body parts clutched in his hands, Kyle chucked them at the concrete. The various parts of the mini-Kyles splattered outwards. I have made a Suddenly, Kyle was Kyle grabbed every nearby... Kyle began to enter... Again? After many iterations, Kyle believed he had... I believe... Kyle left the crime scene. Over the next few years, Kyle became a figurehead of the case of Jerry the... It was... After a couple minutes of other chit-chat... And yet... Kyle looked up from the tiny Kyles clutched in his hand. I believe... Kyle wondered how he... As a way... The crime... The mini-Kyles began... Kyle urged his mini-army to over... The Kyle army began a ramp... Eventually, Mayor Tom installed coin-operated Kyle mashers. Once all the mini-Kyles were gone, Kyle decided to go back to... The hot dog case remained Kyle thought very... Kyle was struck with... Today... Kyle decided. Kyle. Kyle grabbed the tasting helmet. Kyle entered the mayor. Kyle rifled through the cases to decide which he would investigate this. Kyle exited mayor. It was time to investigate the alleged crime. After a couple, Kyle began to pick up each and yet Kyle realized he must use every human sense to figure out the mystery of the. Kyle grabbed a handful of the Kyles and gave them a large lick. Kyle began to chew thoughtfully on a handful of the mini. Kyle began a cycle of Within minutes, Kyle resembled a wriggly, dripping mass of teeth and inside-out flesh.
Oh, that's gross.
Kyle continued to swallow himself throughout the night, and Kyle had fallen into. Kyle was. Over the next several years, after many. However, Kyle thought very. Kyle was struck to.
Definitely get rust.
Kyle decided. Kyle. Kyle decided to spend some time gathering information from the locals roaming around downtown. Kyle decided that if anyone would be able to advise him about his mysteries, it would be the puppies. After a couple minutes of looking, Kyle found a. He knelt down and soon, Kyle thought about what question he would like to ask them.
You know what? Just steal them.
Kyle quietly picked up both pups. He slowly crawled away from the chatting mothers. Kyle entered the mayor. Kyle rifled through the cases to decide. Kyle. It was time to investigate. After a In a single brisk move, Kyle brought his hand upwards and struck the corpse across the face.
Nope, that was the wrong one I wanted to pick.
Kyle thought. Kyle was to death.
Going too fast.
Kyle decided to take some time to choose the. Kyle decided to spend some time gathering information from the local. After he. Kyle thought about what. He slowly. Mayor Tom.
Detective.
Mayor. Kyle rifled through the cases to decide which he would. Kyle. It was time to invest. After a couple minutes of other chit-chat, Kyle grabbed. He began to. The corpse did not seem. Kyle dropped the corpse on the ground. He reached behind him and grabbed the puppies. He gently put them on the ground. Frantically, the puppies crawled into the corpse. They gathered information about the corpse. Eventually, they were finished. Kyle picked. The puppies, said Kyle, believe that this is actually a bear. Everyone. So, said Kyle consulted. It seems so. It was decided to just leave. Kyle took the puppies back to their owners. Both sets of parents were elated that their. Kyle returned home, but on his way, it was missing. Kyle wondered what the bear meant. No answers came. Kyle shrugged and walked away to. But from a bush in the. Kyle's biggest. Kyle thought very. Kyle to Kyle dis- Ky- Kyle Kyle purchased Kyle entered the mayor. Kyle rifled through the cases to. Mayor Tom looked. It was time to invest.
Try these.
After a couple minutes of other chit chat, Kyle. He began. The corpse did not seem. Kyle removed the magic wipes from his pocket and started to wipe the corpse with them. Within a moment, it disappeared, teleported to the magic dimension. A moment of awkward silence followed as Kyle slowly grasped the problem that he created. Kyle slowly turned around. The crowd, frozen in the poses they had been while the corpse was still Because the case was now completely unsolvable, everyone packed up their things and went home.
Makes
The
sense.
next day, Kyle had not. Kyle thought very carefully. Kyle was today. Kyle decided to spend some time gathering information. Oh, Kyle! Kyle decided what he wanted to talk with Rachel about. Would you know anything about a bunch of eyes? Rachel blinked. Well, Kyle decided. Rachel. Kyle. Kyle. Kyle thought very carefully about the first move of his. Kyle was to. Kyle dis. Mayor.
Detective Kyle.
Our city is plagued with Mayor Tom. Kyle rifled through the cases to decide which. Kyle nodded. There's no question. Mayor Tom. Kyle exited. Mayor. They were looking. Neighbor Gabby's.
Good evening, Detective.
Said Mayor Tom.
I hope you're prepared to start your investigation.
They.
Good e- Well,
Hey! After you told me that you were spending your evening in. So I talked to the secretary in City Hall. Kyle decided. Rachel. Kyle. After a couple minutes of other chit chat, Suddenly, Kyle reeled. Rachel? Rachel slid. Rachel said. Rachel looked. Let me. Rachel began. After several minutes of Did anyone. It's not even dead.
idiots! The crimes committed in this city are so amateurish. Where's the excitement? The gravitas!
Mayor Tom started to scream utter gibberish. There was a well, we can catch. Without much trouble, job done, the team turned to the front of City Hall to debrief a bit from. The group chatted back and but they parted. It felt as if that night was the start of something much more diabolical.
Trophy. more set, and then I'm good.
Kyle thought very... Kyle was... to... Kyle just... Kyle...
Grab my tasting helmet, because that makes sense.
Detective Kyle,
said Mayor Tom.
I am glad you are here today.
Our Mayor... Kyle rifled through the cases to decide which he would investigate this evening. Kyle nodded. Mayor Tom looked at Kyle sat. Kyle exited Mayor Tom. It was time to investigate the mystery of 1,000... Kyle slowly approached the dusty, rotting mansion that had called... Kyle used the knocker to give 2 sharp raps on the massive front door. The door slowly swung open, revealing a flabby man in a white-stained tank top. The man spoke.
Want a beer?
The man leaned forward and started gurgling, eyeballs slowly oozing out of his mouth, nose, and ears.
Gross.
Kyle realized that at this moment, his investigation began. Kyle unhinged his jaw and swallowed the man whole.
Makes sense.
Kyle began to digest, gaining information from the juices his stomach produced. The man was 40-some years old. He owned several dogs. His favorite music genre was postmodern classical. But before Kyle could learn more, he heard a muffled voice from within him.
This ain't how Barry goes out.
Barry sprouted from Kyle's mouth, using his hands to spread Kyle's jaws open and push himself upwards. Kyle tried to push Barry back down to continue his investigation. The two fought over control of Barry for several hours. Eventually, wearied of the fight and just generally irritated, Kyle lost it.
Barry!
He shouted.
I am trying to do you a favor!
Barry stopped squirming in Kyle's stomach. Kyle heard a muffled sob.
I know, man, I know,
said Barry.
but I got things in my life I don't want you to know. Don't want anyone to know. I'm a broken man,
he continued,
full as much as anyone with problems and mistakes.
Barry, said Kyle gently, we've all made mistakes. We've all done things we aren't proud. Little should I be the one to judge you for what you've done. Let me know, Barry. Barry didn't say anything, but after a moment, he nodded once. Kyle's digestive juices kicked into overdrive, dissolving every atom of Barry's being all at once. Kyle was overwhelmed with information pertaining to Barry. Suddenly, he knew every detail there was to know. Kyle had no way of sorting through the massive amount of information that had come to him. He began to sweat. Sensing an overload, Kyle's body rejected the digested Barry soup. Kyle spewed Barry all over the sidewalk. The stomach juices evaporated on the sidewalk, sending Barry floating off into the sky and on to a new adventure.
Good for him.
Kyle had not been able to determine the cause of Barry's mystery while he had all of his information. But he did remember one thing. Barry was a good man, and he hoped that wherever he was, he would be loved and accepted. Kyle did not solve the mystery of 1,000 Eyes.
Oops.
Today, Kyle would try his best at... Kyle decided... Kyle rifled through the cases to decide which... Mayor Tom looked at Kyle. Kyle exited. It was time to investigate the mystery. Kyle realized that at this moment, his investigation began. Kyle decided to try to slap some sense into the man.
Hey! Snap out of it!
Kyle screamed. He grabbed the man by the collar and started roughly slapping with his other hand. The man seemed rather uninterested in what Kyle was doing and continued vomiting in between slaps.
Blech.
After a while, Kyle decided to change tactics. "Sir, you are respectable," said Kyle, "and I understand what you are going through, but my motives are pure." Kyle hoisted the man on his shoulders and prepared to fling him into the ground. Suddenly, the man fought back. He grabbed Kyle by the shoulders and swung him above his head, throwing him into the air.
Ooh.
"You are most noble," said the man, "but I must insist that your methods are somewhat rude." The two fought back and forth, muttering compliments to each other as they did. Eventually, however, they began to tire. Agreeing to take a break, Kyle and the man walked to a nearby diner and shared lunch together.
Well, that's nice.
They talked of the local political climate, their favorite drinks, the weather, and many other things. After several hours, the two parted ways amicably. The next day, Kyle was fired from his job as a detective for completely botching his investigation.
It happens. There are a few other options there.
It was time. Kyle realized that at this moment, his investigation began. Kyle pushed past the oozing man to look for clues inside the house. The inner atrium was dotted with bookshelves and rugs. Every surface was filled with trash bags full of vomited eyes. Suddenly, Kyle had an uncontrollable urge to hide and see if anyone found him. Kyle started to run around the house, looking for the best hiding spot he could find. Kyle considered hiding behind the couch. He ran his fingers across the top, but he continued on. Kyle opened the cupboards to see. One by one, Kyle exhausted every possibility he could find inside the house, all except one lonely door at the back. Kyle walked slowly towards the door, taking each step deliberately, and soon he stood in front of it. Timidly, Kyle reached for the doorknob and began to turn. Slowly, the door opened. The crack grew bigger and bigger, allowing Kyle to see what was inside. Kyle found that the door hid a very special goo pit, filled to the brim with seething, fragrant jelly. Overjoyed, after several days of not being, they searched the house. Kyle spent the rest. Kyle had hidden himself very well.
Okay.
It was. Kyle realized that at this moment, his investigation began.
Well, I'll do this one.
Kyle felt a wave of empathy come upon him. "Oh, you," said Kyle. "I'm so sorry." Kyle began to pat the man on the back. Suddenly, Kyle began to empathetically spew eyeballs out of his mouth.
Gross.
Kyle and the man's eyeballs began to mound on the sidewalk, forming an impassable barrier for cars and pedestrians. Kyle became empathetic to the people he was causing trouble. His legs and arms seized, keeping him from moving. Kyle's empathy continued to grow. Kyle, now mega empathetic, was struck with every bad thing that anyone was experiencing all at once. Kyle ballooned in size and began spinning. His pores started to spout steam and his body began to let loose a low whistle. However showy, though, Kyle's empathetic efforts were to no avail. Kyle realized that his empathy, however noble, could not cure things like eyeball vomiting.
I'd agree.
However, through his spinning and spitting of steam, Kyle was able to generate a fair amount of electricity. The city took Kyle and hooked him into the electrical. Over the next several years, Kyle produced a large amount of the city's power. Kyle Power became a source of engineering study along the lines of wind and hydroelectric. Kyle was awarded several honors for being such a dependable and low-effort source of good for the city. Although Kyle's new career had given him so much acceptance and love from the city, he still felt somewhat hollow. Kyle
didn't
never
solve the mystery.
solved the mystery of 1,000 eyes.
It's gotta be
It was
one of these
time.
options.
Kyle realized that at this moment, his investigation. Kyle, the inner atrium was dotted with bookshelves and rugs. Every surface was filled with trash bags. Kyle decided to pick through the man's belongings and see if he could find anything incriminating. Kyle began to open drawers and cupboards, looking briefly at each item they contained. Kyle found notes, flashlights, accounting records, phone numbers for friends, batteries, and many other things. As Kyle searched, he grabbed items he found interesting and put them in his pocket for later.
So he stole.
After several hours of searching, Kyle had found nothing he could arrest anyone for. Disappointed, Kyle slowly walked out the door, past the vomiting man, and back to his apartment. But on his way back, Kyle realized that his day had not been totally wasted. Kyle's hand dropped to his pocket. Inside were still all of the treasures he had found in the man's house. Kyle decided to sell the evidence items to see how much he could get for them. After talking with a few pawn shops, Kyle was able to acquire about $20 for his items. Overjoyed, Kyle decided to make another run to the house to see what else he could find. Over the rest of the evening, the man's house was slowly drained of everything inside it as Kyle sold more and more. But once it was emptied, Kyle was not satisfied. Kyle began tearing chunks of the wall out of the house, creating a pile to sell to a nearby lumber company. Piece by piece, Kyle dismantled the entire house, selling its materials as scrap. Soon there was nothing left. At last, Kyle felt like he had done as much work as he was able to do. He stood looking at the clear space, and he smiled. Kyle walked past the man, still hunching and vomiting, for the last time that day. He patted him on the back. Kyle was able to return home feeling accomplished. He had done a lot of work that day, and he was tired. Kyle fell onto his pillow and went to sleep immediately. He had not solved the mystery of 1,000 eyes.
It's gotta be the thing like Rachel.
It was time to invest. Kyle realized that at this moment, the inner eight. Suddenly, Kyle had an idea. If Rachel were in this situation, Kyle remembered how Rachel had solved the hot dog murder by looking at Kyle decided to do the simplest thing he could think to do. Inside, facing outwards, was the Jam Man.
Hello,
said the Jam Man.
Would you like to buy some of my jam?
The man hiding in the closet selling jam.
Hello, said Kyle. That depends on what sort of jam you are selling and at what price.
My jam is famous in all the land,
said the Jam Man.
However, alas,
he continued,
many have recently complained that my jam is not what it once was. In a moment of weakness one night, I realized that I could cut costs by adding small amounts of other things to my jam. And so to the mixture I added a tablespoon of blended rat. The jam was excellent and profits soared. Clouded by greed, I began to add more blended rat into my jam recipe. I began making double, triple what I had before. But one day, I went too far. Just over half the jam was of rat. The jam was not great. It was hardly good, and the public noted. I was too far gone. Slowly, the blended rat took over my brand. So here I am,
said the Jam Man,
sitting in the closet. Will you pardon the Jam Man his faults and invest in his passion?
The Jam Man held up a jar of substance. It seemed to be a slimy paste full of suspect organs and eyes.
Oh, heck, I can't say no.
The man walked up behind Kyle as the Jam Man talked. He brushed Kyle aside. The Jam Man gleefully opened the jar and shoved the contents down the man's throat. Immediately, the man turned around and began to hurl eyeballs onto the floor. And suddenly, Kyle realized.
My gosh,
said Kyle, plucking the jar from the Jam Man's hand. The eyes are coming from the rats in this jam! The Jam Man scowled at Kyle and made a cry of
You may think you have won, clever detective,
said the Jam Man.
But I haven't lost yet.
The Jam Man suddenly melted into a jam-like substance, slid under Kyle's legs, and out the door to freedom. The man and Kyle looked at the space the Jam Man had been in. There was a silence. There was nothing to say. Eventually, Kyle left the house knowing that the man would vomit eyes no longer. The case had been solved, but as he walked home, Kyle remained a bit troubled. Kyle was sure the Jam Man would return.
Yeah.
Kyle thought very carefully. Kyle was today.
Put on my outfit.
Kyle decided. Kyle's. Kyle purchased. Kyle entered. Mayor. Kyle rifled through the cases to decide which. It was time to investigate the mystery of. Kyle realized. Kyle pushed past the oozing. The inner atrium was dotted. Kyle produced the suction hands and attached them to his fingers. Kyle slowly reached out toward the nearest wall, intending to test his suction abilities and see if he could climb. Kyle pressed his hand against the wall. He drew himself upward and then retracted his arm to suction again. The suction on his hands was far too powerful. Instead of releasing, Kyle moved the entire house. Kyle began shaking his arm back and forth, trying to dislodge himself from the wall. The house began to jump, twist, and turn. It rolled around and around, crashing into yards and trees all over the neighborhood. Eventually, Kyle was able to dislodge himself. Within a few moments, the house settled, leaving a cloud of dust in the air. Slowly, Kyle crawled outside to get some fresh air. Kyle found that he had landed in the giant lake of carnivorous cake.
That makes sense.
Kyle was immediately attacked by several hungry carnivorous cakes. Kyle spent his evening fending off the cakes and slowly making his way back to the crime scene. When he arrived, he found that nothing had changed outside of the house being completely missing. Kyle decided to leave his work for the day and take some time to... He returned to his apartment weary and covered in small bite marks. Kyle decided that the next day he would try to investigate the case again. But, unfortunately, the cakes had already devoured the entire house and all evidence along with it. Kyle did not solve the mystery of 1,000 eyes. Kyle thought Kyle was struck. Today, Kyle
I never grabbed this.
Kyle grabbed a Kyle and Mayor Tom sat behind.
Detective Kyle, said Mayor Tom, I am glad you are here today.
Kyle rifled through the cases to decide which. Kyle nodded. Kyle. It was time to investigate the mystery of 1,000 eyes. Kyle realized that at this. The inner atrium was. Kyle took the magnifying. Kyle knew he wanted. Kyle began. Was he really a. Kyle began. Kyle began bashing his head into the floor. A small. Soon, Kyle began sucking the bugs and worms around. Kyle stopped. Through. The world changed to be. Kyle had become the buggiest man in the whole wide world. Kyle had become the Bug Master.
Trophy. Oh, I want the frog. I'm gonna clean that up a little bit.
Kyle woke up. Kyle was struck with an uncomfortable... Today? Kyle quickly crouched down on the floor. Kyle lay and... After a moment... Kyle, he began from Kyle lived. It was a he never, but Kyle